The complaint Marcus Delacroix adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his relics as he strode through the gleaming corridors of Walsh & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. Everything about Marcus screamed success from his perfectly tailored suits to his corner office with its panoramic view of downtown. As the firm's operations supervisor, he took pride in maintaining the highest standards of efficiency and professionalism. That pride, however, was constantly tested by one particular employee who seemed to embody everything Marcus despised about mediocrity. "There he is again," Marcus muttered to his assistant, watching as Santiago Rivera slowly pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway. The older man moved with deliberate, measured steps, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. His uniform, while clean, showed signs of wear, and his graying hair was always slightly disheveled by the end of his shift. Santiago paused at the water fountain, rubbing his temples with calloused hands. To Marcus, it looked like laziness, another excuse to avoid work. The custodian had been employed at the firm for nearly 2 years, and in Marcus's opinion, he was the weakest link in their otherwise flawless operation. "Sir," his assistant ventured, hesitantly. "Look at him," Marcus continued, his voice rising with irritation. "It's barely past noon and he's already taking breaks. The bathrooms on the 12th floor were still dirty yesterday morning, and I found dust on the conference room tables. It's unacceptable." Santiago seemed to sense the scrutiny and glanced up, offering a tired but genuine smile before returning to his cart. The gesture only irritated Marcus further. How dare this man smile when his work was so substandard? Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in his office drafting what he hoped would be Santiago's termination letter. He pulled up the custodian's employment file on his computer, noting every instance of what he perceived as poor performance. The man was consistently the last to finish his rounds, often seemed distracted during staff meetings, and had the audacity to request schedule flexibility for personal commitments. "Personal commitments?" Marcus scoffed, typing furiously. "Probably. Just wants more time to lounge around at home." He documented everything: the slightly streaky windows, the occasional mist spot on the marble floors, and the way Santiago sometimes appeared to doze off during his lunch break in the staff room. In Marcus's mind, these weren't signs of an overworked employee. They were evidence of someone who simply didn't care about excellence. The final straw came when Marcus discovered Santiago using the firm's computer in the break room during his shift. Company policy was clear about personal use of equipment, and Marcus had caught him red-handed. He didn't bother to see what Santiago was doing on the screen. The violation was enough. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood outside the corner office of Vivian Walsh, the firm's founding partner and CEO. The frosted glass door bore her name in elegant gold lettering, and Marcus straightened his shoulders. Before knocking, "Come in," came the crisp, authoritative voice from within. Vivian Walsh commanded respect without effort. In her early 50s, she had built the firm from nothing, earning a reputation as both a brilliant legal mind and a fair but demanding leader. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "Marcus," she said, glancing up from a stack of legal briefs. "What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" "I need to discuss a personnel issue that's been affecting our operational standards." He placed his carefully prepared report on her desk. "It's regarding Santiago Rivera, our night custodian. I'm afraid his performance has become unacceptable, and I believe termination is the only viable solution." Vivian picked up the report, her expression unreadable as she scanned Marcus's detailed complaints. She'd built her career on reading people, on seeing beyond surface presentations to the truth beneath. Something about Marcus's absolute certainty gave her pause. "These are serious allegations," she said finally. "Have you spoken directly with Mr. Rivera about these concerns?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no. I felt it was better to document the issues first. The pattern of behavior speaks for itself." Vivian set the report aside and leaned back in her chair. In her experience, the most revealing truths often lay in the stories people didn't think to tell. "I'll review this thoroughly," she said. "But before making any decisions, I'd like to conduct my own assessment of the situation. Of course, Marcus replied, already envisioning the formal termination meeting. I'm confident you'll reach the same conclusion. As Marcus left her office, Vivian turned to stare out her window at the bustling city below. Something about this situation didn't sit right with her. 30 years of business, she'd learned that the most valuable employees were often the ones others overlooked or underestimated. She made a mental note to pay closer attention to Santiago Rivera, not through reports or secondhand observations, but through her own eyes. Sometimes the heart of a matter was only visible when you took the time to truly see. The secret discovery Vivian Walsh had always believed that true leadership required understanding people beyond their job descriptions. That principle had guided her through 3 decades of building her law firm, and it was what compelled her to stay late on a Thursday evening, long after most of the staff had gone home. She positioned herself in the rarely used law library on the 15th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a clear view of the main corridor. From here, she could observe Santiago Rivera without interfering with his work routine. If Marcus's complaints held merit, she would see the evidence firsthand. At precisely 6:30, Santiago emerged from the service elevator, pushing his cart with the same measured pace Marcus had criticized. But as Vivian watched more carefully, she noticed something Marcus had missed. Santiago's movements weren't lazy, they were methodical. He cleaned each surface thoroughly, checking his work twice before moving on. What struck her most was his attention to detail. Santiago carefully straightened the magazines in the waiting areas, ensured every chair was properly positioned, and even took time to water the office plants, a task that wasn't officially part of his duties. This wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't care about his work. As the evening progressed, Vivian noticed Santiago's fatigue becoming more apparent. He paused occasionally to steady himself against a wall, and she caught him rubbing his eyes as if trying to stay alert. When he reached the break room around 9 o'clock, he sat heavily in one of the plastic chairs and pulled out a worn notebook. Curious about Marcus's accusation regarding computer use, Vivian quietly made her way closer. Through the break room's glass partition, she could see Santiago hunched over the desktop computer, but he wasn't browsing social media or playing games. Instead, he was carefully typing what appeared to be lesson plans, occasionally referring to his handwritten notes. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Santiago looked up sharply at the sound. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Instead of looking guilty or defensive, Santiago simply nodded respectfully before returning to his work. There was dignity in that gesture that Marcus had completely failed to recognize. By 10:45, Santiago had finished his rounds. Vivian expected him to head for the parking garage, but instead, he gathered his personal items, including a battered messenger bag she'd never noticed before, and walked toward the building's main entrance. Something compelled her to follow. Maintaining a discreet distance, Vivian followed Santiago through the downtown streets. He moved with more energy now, despite having worked a full shift. His destination surprised her, a modest community center, wedged between a laundromat and a small grocery store in one of the city's immigrant neighborhoods. Through the center's large front windows, Vivian could see Santiago greeting a group of adults seated around folding tables. Their faces lit up when they saw him, and several people stood to embrace him warmly. He unpacked books and papers from his messenger bag, transforming from a tired custodian into an animated teacher. A small sign by the door caught Vivian's attention. Free English classes, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. All welcome. Below that, in smaller print, classes taught by volunteer instructors. Donations appreciated but never required. Vivian found herself drawn closer to the windows. Inside, Santiago was helping a young woman sound out words from a children's book, while an elderly man practiced writing letters on a whiteboard. The students ranged in age from teenagers to seniors, united by their determination to learn and their obvious respect for their teacher. During a break, Vivian watched Santiago distribute snacks and bottled water to his students. She noticed him slip a $20 bill to a mother with 2 young children, refusing her protests with a gentle shake of his head. These weren't the actions of someone who was lazy or didn't care. These were the actions of someone whose heart was fully engaged in serving others. As she walked back to her car, Vivian's mind raced with questions. How long had Santiago been teaching these classes? How did he afford to provide supplies and food on a custodian's salary? Most importantly, how had she and her entire organization failed to see the extraordinary man who cleaned their offices every night? The next morning, Vivian arrived at her office before dawn, but not to prepare for client meetings or review cases. She had researched to not the kind that involved legal precedents or corporate documents, but the kind that required her to truly understand the man Marcus wanted to fire. She started with Santiago's employment file. Reading beyond the basic information Marcus had provided, his original application was handwritten in careful script, listing previous experience as an adjunct professor at several community colleges. His references were glowing, praising his dedication, reliability, and positive impact on students. Most telling was a brief note in his file from the night security supervisor. Santiago often stays after his shift to help with special events or emergency cleaning. Never complains, never asks for overtime pay. Good man to have on the team. Vivian leaned back in her chair, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form a picture that was radically different from Marcus's assessment. Santiago Rivera wasn't a lazy employee who didn't care about his work. He was a man who cared so deeply about serving others that he worked 2 jobs. Using his day job to fund his real passion for teaching, the question now wasn't whether Santiago deserved to be fired. The question was how she could better support someone whose dedication to others reflected the very values her firm claimed to uphold. For the first time in years, Vivian felt she was about to learn something that would change not just one employee's life, but her understanding of what it meant to lead with purpose. The tragic past Vivian's investigation into Santiago Rivera's background led her to make an unexpected call to Father Benedict Moreau, whose name appeared as a character reference in Santiago's employment file. The elderly priest agreed to meet her at Sacred Heart Community Center, the same building where Santiago taught his evening classes. Father Benedict was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands weathered by decades of service. He greeted Vivian in the center's small kitchen, pouring coffee from a pot that had seen better days. Santiago is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. Father Benedict began without preamble, but his story isn't an easy one too. Here, as they sat at a scarred wooden table surrounded by children's artwork, the priest painted a picture of Santiago's life that shattered every assumption Marcus had made. 5 years earlier, Santiago Rivera had been Dr. Santiago Rivera, a respected professor of comparative literature at Metropolitan University with tenure, published research, and a reputation as one of the most beloved instructors on campus. He had everything, Father Benedict explained, his voice heavy with memory. Beautiful home, a promising career, respect from his colleagues. But Santiago has always been guided by his conscience rather than his comfort. The first crack in Santiago's perfect life came when the university announced massive budget cuts. Rather than quietly accepting the layoffs of adjunct professors and support staff, Santiago had organized protests and lobbied the administration to find alternatives. He publicly criticized the university's priorities, questioning how they could justify executive bonuses while eliminating jobs that real families depended on. The administration didn't appreciate his activism, Father Benedict continued. They found ways to make his life difficult, scheduling conflicts. Reduced course loads hints that his contract might not be renewed, but Santiago wouldn't back down. The breaking point came when Santiago discovered that several of his undocumented students were being threatened with deportation after ICE raids in the area. While other faculty members expressed sympathy privately, Santiago took action. He opened his home as a sanctuary, used his university resources to connect students with legal aid, and even attended court hearings as a character witness. The university accused him of using his position for political purposes, Father Benedict said, shaking his head. They claimed he was creating liability issues. Santiago was given a choice: stop his advocacy work or lose his job. Vivian could guess what Santiago had chosen. He chose his students. Without hesitation, But the consequences went beyond just losing his position. His wife, Carmen, had been supportive initially, but as their financial situation deteriorated and Santiago showed no signs of backing down from his principles, their marriage began to fracture. The priest paused, gathering himself for the most painful part of the story. Carmen filed for divorce 6 months after Santiago lost his tenure. She said she couldn't watch him destroy their future for strangers who would never appreciate his sacrifice. She took their savings, the house, everything they'd built together. Vivian felt a chill run through her. The timeline would have coincided with Santiago's hiring at her firm. He had been starting over from nothing, yet he'd never shown any bitterness or self-pity during his employment. "How did he end up here?" she asked, gesturing around the community center. Father Benedict smiled for the first time during their conversation. "Santiago came to me about 3 years ago. He'd been working various jobs, night security, custodial work, anything that would give him flexibility to continue helping undocumented families. He asked if he could use our community center too, teach English classes." The priest led Vivian into the main room, where Santiago held his classes. The walls were covered with certificates of achievement, letters of thanks in multiple languages, and photos of graduation celebrations. In the center of one wall hung a simple plaque, dedicated to Professor Santiago Rivera, whose heart teaches what textbooks cannot. His students pooled their money to buy that plaque, Father Benedict explained. Many of them can barely afford food, but they insisted on honoring him. Santiago cried when they presented it to him. As they walked through the center, Father Benedict shared more details that painted a complete picture of Santiago's character. He used nearly his entire salary from the law firm to buy supplies for his students. He tutored individuals who needed extra help on weekends, completely free of charge. When students faced evictions or medical emergencies, Santiago somehow found ways to help, even if it meant he went without meals himself. "But why does he seem so tired at work?" Vivian asked. "My supervisor thinks he's lazy." Father Benedict's expression hardened slightly. "Santiago teaches here until 1 in the morning, twice a week. But he also volunteers at the county detention center on Saturdays, helping detainees prepare for immigration hearings. On Sundays, he drives elderly community members to medical appointments because they don't speak enough English to navigate the healthcare system alone." The picture was becoming clearer, and it made Vivian ashamed of how her organization had failed to see Santiago's true worth. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything comfortable and secure in his life to serve others, and they had judged him for being tired. "There's something else you should know," Father Benedict said quietly. "Santiago never talks about this, but I believe it's important for you to understand the full scope of his character. Last winter, when the city's homeless shelters were overcrowded, Santiago gave up his apartment and moved into a small room above the center's office. He said he didn't need much space since he was rarely home anyway." Vivian stared at the priest, struggling to process this information. "He's been homeless? Not homeless? He's been homeless, choosing to live with less so others can have more? There's a difference. Though I'm not sure Santiago sees it that way." As Vivian prepared to leave, Father Benedict walked her to her car. "Mrs. Walsh, I don't know what brought you here today, but I hope you see Santiago for who he truly is. He's not just a janitor who happens to teach on the side. He's an educator who happens to clean offices to fund his real calling. There's a profound difference between those two things." Driving back to her firm, Davian realized that tomorrow's conversation with Marcus would be very different from what he expected. Santiago Rivera wasn't just an employee who deserved to keep his job. He was exactly the kind of person her firm should be proud to have on their team. The real question was whether they deserved to have someone of his character working for them at all. The revelation: the following Monday morning, Vivian Walsh called an emergency all-staff meeting. Word spread quickly through the corridors of Walsh and Associates that something significant was happening. The CEO rarely summoned everyone from partners to support staff without advance notice. By 9 o'clock, the firm's main conference room was packed with curious and slightly anxious employees. Marcus Alacqua sat in the front row, confident that this meeting would vindicate his assessment of Santiago Rivera. He had spent the weekend imagining how he would gracefully accept Vivian's praise for his diligent supervision and attention to detail. Perhaps this would even lead to a promotion. Santiago himself stood quietly near the back of the room, his cleaning uniform freshly pressed despite his obvious exhaustion. He had worked his usual Thursday night shift at the firm, followed by teaching until 1 in the morning, and then spent his weekend helping 3 families prepare for citizenship interviews. The bags under his eyes told the story of a man running on determination rather than rest. Vivian entered the room, carrying a manila folder and a laptop. Her expression was unreadable as she moved to the front of the conference table, her presence commanding immediate silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the authority that had built this firm from nothing. "I've called this meeting to address a serious matter that speaks to the core values of our organization and how we treat the people who make our success possible." She opened the folder and pulled out Marcus's termination report. "I received a recommendation that we dismiss one of our employees based on allegations of poor performance, laziness, and unprofessional behavior." Marcus straightened in his seat, preparing to nod seriously when his contributions were acknowledged. "The employee in question is Santiago Rivera, our night custodian," Vivian continued. The report detailed numerous complaints about his work ethic, his apparent fatigue during shifts, and his use of company computers for personal activities. Murmurs rippled through the room. Several people glanced toward Santiago, who remained perfectly still, his dignity intact despite the public scrutiny. "Before making any decision, I chose to investigate these claims personally," Vivian said, clicking open her laptop. "What I discovered has fundamentally changed my understanding not just of Mr. Rivera, but of how we as an organization see and value the people around us." The laptop screen projected onto the room's large monitor, displaying a photograph of Santiago surrounded by his evening students at Sacred Heart Community Center. The image showed him helping an elderly woman practice reading while children played quietly nearby. "This is where Santiago Rivera goes after finishing his shift here," Vivian announced. "He teaches free English classes to undocumented immigrants, refugees, and anyone in our community who needs help navigating life in America." The room fell completely silent. Marcus felt his confidence beginning to crumble as more images filled the screen. Santiago distributing food to his students, helping someone fill out job applications, celebrating a student's first successful job interview. Mr. Rivera uses the computer during his break, not for personal entertainment, but to prepare lesson plans and educational materials for his students. Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger. "The personal commitments he requests schedule flexibility for involve teaching people who work multiple jobs and can only attend classes late at night." She clicked to the next slide, showing Santiago's academic credentials and letters of recommendation from his former university colleagues. "Before joining our custodial staff, Santiago Rivera was Dr. Santiago Rivera, a tenured professor of comparative literature who sacrificed his career to protect vulnerable students from deportation." Gasps echoed through the room. Partners who had walked past Santiago countless times without really seeing him now stared with new understanding. The fatigue that was interpreted as laziness. Vivian's eyes found Marcus in the crowd. Comes from working here until midnight, then teaching until 1 in the morning, followed by weekend volunteer work at detention centers and homeless shelters. Santiago Rivera doesn't just have one job. He has dedicated his entire life to serving others. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks as colleagues began turning to look at him. His carefully constructed case against Santiago was collapsing in real time, replaced by a portrait of someone whose character far exceeded his own. "But here's what troubles me most," Vivian said, closing the laptop and facing the room directly. "How did we fail so completely to see the extraordinary person working among us? How did assumptions and surface judgments blind us to someone whose dedication to service embodies everything we claim to value as a firm?" She walked over to where Santiago stood, gesturing for him to join her at the front of the room. After a moment's hesitation, he moved forward, his head held high despite the circumstances. "Santiago," Vivian said, addressing him directly, "owe you an apology on behalf of this entire organization. We should have seen you, really seen you, long before now." Turning back to the room, she made an announcement that no one, least of all Marcus, had expected, effective immediately. "I'm offering Santiago Rivera the position of Director of Community Outreach and Social Responsibility. His salary will reflect the value he brings to our organization, and his role will involve developing programs that connect our firm with the communities we serve." The room erupted in spontaneous applause. Partners and support staff alike rose to their feet, many wiping away tears as they looked at Santiago with new eyes. He stood quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition, but maintaining the same humble dignity that had carried him through years of being overlooked. Marcus remained seated, his face burning with shame as the applause continued around him. The noise finally died down. Santiago stepped forward to address the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh," he said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I accept your offer, but I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this work for recognition. I did it because it needed to be done, and because everyone deserves to be seen as worthy of dignity and respect." His gaze briefly met Marcus's across the room, and instead of anger or accusation, Marcus saw only sad understanding, the look of someone who knew what it felt like to be judged by appearances rather than character. As the meeting dispersed and colleagues surrounded Santiago with congratulations and handshakes, Marcus sat alone in his chair, finally understanding the profound difference between managing people and actually seeing them. He transformation 6 months after Santiago Rivera's unexpected promotion. The corridors of Walsh and Associates hummed with a different energy. What had once been a sterile environment focused solely on billable hours and profit, margins had transformed into something resembling a community. The change was most visible in the firm's newly established 16th floor, which Santiago had converted into a multi-purpose space for community programs. Santiago stood before a group of law students from the local university, his voice animated, as he explained the intricacies of immigration law to future attorneys. Gone were his custodial uniforms, replaced by simple but dignified business attire. More importantly, gone was the exhaustion that had once marked his features. For the first time in years, Santiago Rivera looked like a man who was sleeping enough hours to sustain his passion. "The law is not just words on paper," he told the students. "Every statute, every precedent, every legal brief represents someone's life, someone's dreams, someone's hope for a better future. Never forget that." Vivian watched from the doorway, amazed at how naturally Santiago had grown into his leadership role. His first initiative had been establishing pro bono immigration clinics, staffed by volunteer attorneys from the firm. What started as a once-monthly program now ran 3 days a week, serving over 200 families each month. But perhaps the most surprising transformation was happening at the back of the classroom, where Marcus Delacroix sat taking careful notes. The former supervisor had initially resisted Santiago's elevation, harboring resentment about being publicly embarrassed during the all-staff meeting. However, guilt and curiosity had eventually drawn him to attend one of Santiago's presentations about the firm's new community programs. That first session had shattered Marcus's remaining prejudices. Listening to Santiago explain how legal advocacy could literally save families from separation, Marcus began to understand what real leadership looked like. It wasn't about maintaining control or catching subordinates in mistakes. It was about seeing potential where others saw problems and lifting people up rather than finding reasons to tear them down. "The beautiful thing about justice," Santiago continued, "is that it doesn't ask about your background, your accent, or how much money you have. It asks only whether you're willing to stand up for what's right." After the session ended, Marcus approached Santiago hesitantly. Their relationship had been awkward for months following the public revelation of Santiago's true character. But Marcus had been working on something he hoped might begin to repair the damage. "Santiago, do you have a moment?" Marcus asked, clutching a folder against his chest, of course. "What can I help you with?" Marcus opened the folder, revealing meticulously organized documents and spreadsheets. "I've been working on a proposal for expanding the English language programs. I know you're stretched thin between the legal clinics and the evening classes, so I thought maybe I could help coordinate some additional volunteer teachers." Santiago studied the papers, his eyebrows rising with genuine surprise. Marcus had clearly spent considerable time researching curriculum development, volunteer recruitment, and program logistics. The attention to detail that had once been used to criticize Santiago was now being channeled into supporting his work. "Is excellent work, Marcus," Santiago said, and Marcus felt something loosen in his chest at hearing his name spoken without resentment. "But I have to ask why." Marcus looked out the window at the city below, gathering his thoughts. "Because I was wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong. And being wrong about someone like you made me realize how wrong I might be about other people too." He turned back to Santiago with an expression of genuine remorse. "I spent so much time looking for problems that I missed seeing solutions. Weren't the problem with this organization I was? It's my attitude, my assumptions, my complete failure to see past surface appearances." Santiago set the folder aside and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Marcus. The question is what we do after we recognize them." "I want to do better," Marcus said simply. "Not just as an employee, but as a person." "You consider letting me help with the community programs?" "No. I don't deserve the opportunity after how I treated you, but I'd like to try to earn it." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into community work with the same intensity. He had once applied to finding fault with others. He coordinated volunteer schedules, managed supply donations, and even began attending Santiago's evening English classes, not as a supervisor checking up on an employee, but as a student learning about the immigrant experience from the people living it. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Marcus had to confront years of ingrained prejudices and assumptions. But under Santiago's patient guidance, he began to see people as individuals rather than categories. He learned names and stories, celebrated small victories, and discovered that helping others brought a satisfaction that no performance bonus had ever provided. One evening, as they worked together preparing materials for the next day's legal clinic, Vivian stopped by Santiago's office. She found both men surrounded by case files, debating the best way to help a family facing deportation, despite having lived in the community for 15 years. "How are things going?" she asked. Santiago looked up with a smile that reached his eyes. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Marcus has been invaluable. His organizational skills and attention to detail are exactly what we needed to expand our services." Marcus flushed with pride at the praise, still somewhat amazed that he had found purpose in work he would have once considered beneath him. "The real success story," Santiago continued, "isn't just the families we're helping. It's proving that people can change, that assumptions can be overcome, and that everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are." As Vivian left them to their work, she reflected on how profoundly Santiago's presence had changed their organization. The firm's reputation in the community had never been stronger, and employee satisfaction had reached all-time highs. More importantly, they had created a culture where people looked for the best in each other rather than the worst. 6 months earlier, Raquas Delacroix had seen only a tired janitor who didn't meet his standards. Now he saw Santiago Rivera, clearly not as a former professor or a current director, but as a man whose hidden heart had transformed everyone around him simply by refusing to let circumstances diminish his commitment to serving others. Sometimes the most profound changes begin when someone finally takes the time to truly see the person standing right in front of them.